Now I'm going to take a look at step 7, liquidity. Now this is an evolving topic, and I've put more emphasis on it as a result of what's happened with COVID-19. I think we've learned an awful lot about the importance of liquidity, especially considering the shutdown and the impact on companies. The basic concept around liquidity is, does the company have sufficient cash flow, use the word liquidity, for both day-to-day operations and for growth? Remember the cycle of that. You have to buy something, do something to it, sell it, and get paid. So do they have sufficient cash flow? Then, how will the company sustain itself in the time of crisis like COVID-19? I think we've learned a valuable lesson on that. So getting started, the first thing is I'd like to introduce the word of interpret. What does interpret mean? Remember, it has a couple of different meanings, but it's to make sense of, give an interpretation or rendition. So when we try to interpret liquidity, there are 3 parts that we use for liquidity and leverage. First, we compute ratios. Then we organize them to be able to interpret them. We then develop an understanding of the relationship between the numbers, and we draw a conclusion. So why do we want to look at liquidity? Well, the first thing is we assume that the firm is a going concern. Okay, you might want to watch the video on going concern opinions, but when we look at this, the analysis may show potential risks with an ability to fund an organization in the future. Now, in the past, these were much rarer, and when you start looking at this and going deeper, the firm may not really have the ability to continue in business. We've seen that fairly recently with a lot of the retail bankruptcies, Neiman Marcus, J.C. Penney. We also see it in things like AMC theaters and others. So what we want to do is take a look at this. What is their ability to generate cash? What's the capacity to grow? Operational efficiency and opportunities to improve cash flow are also there. And remember, improving cash flows generally results in increased profitability. Now, when we look at it, we're going to look at it from a couple of different ways. First, we're going to look at it from a quantity. How much do you actually have? What's the timing of that? What's the quality? And what's the velocity? So we want to look at all 4 aspects. We can't just look at one piece. We have to look at everything. So the first step I did here is steel dynamics, and we can see the flow. Purchase raw materials, work in process, finished goods, accounts receivable, collection of receivables. So this is the process. So they're buying raw material. It takes the time to convert them to that. So if I'm going through this and I can see a current ratio, you would say, okay, that's good. So that's the amount. Okay. The working cap is $3 billion as of 12/31/18. We then look, what's the timing or velocity of the cash flow? Okay, so what we do is we then use inventory conversion, accounts receivable conversion, accounts payable, and come up with the cash conversion cycle. So this 82.99 days is telling us that this takes 82.99 days to run. Okay, so that's a speed or velocity. Okay, it takes time. It's not something that you can all of a sudden just like this change. Now, if you baked bread and ran a bakery, this cycle is going to be very, very short. Okay, so we need to look at that, and this is going to help us evaluate. We look at the mix of receivable turnover, inventory to working capital, trade receivables to capital, and when we look at it, a lot of it is in inventory. Now in inventory, we got raw materials, That's just waiting to be made into steel. You have work in process. It hasn't been finally produced, but then you have the final product waiting to be shipped to the inventory. We then go and take a look here of what the simple free cash flow is, which is the cash flow from operations. We start out with simple cash flow from operations, less acquisitions, and current portion of long-term debt. We can calculate the working capital per day. In case 32 million a day to run. How much do they need? 2,683,000,000 on an ongoing basis. So when I compute it and they have the 313 actual working capital, you can see that based on the per diem cost, they got room to grow by 2.8% from the existing working capital. Now, all these numbers were before COVID-19. So how do we interpret that? Is STLD has enough working capital to support the operating cycle of its business as it is today, was pre-COVID-19, and an approximate growth of sales of 2.8%. So that tells me if the company's strategic plan is to grow by 5%, they need to generate more working capital. The speed of the accounts receivable has been improving, but at 32.17 is above the terms, 30 days, they are giving to customers. There may be opportunities to reduce this by stronger credit collection processes. The speed of accounts payable is very fast, as they are paying vendors faster than normal 30 days, leading me to believe they're taking advantage of vendor discounts for faster payment, but they could try to slow it down, which is a discussion. The inventory turnover and conversion time appears adequate for a manufacturing company. It has increased from prior years as they have added more specialist value-added products that may take longer to produce. Because if it's raw material, raw steel versus a rolled steel, there's an extra process and that may take a few days. We should be watching this for an inventory buildup. When I look at the historical cash flow from operations and free cash flow, general amounts to serve the current portion of long-term debt. So that's my interpretation of those numbers. This is the key piece, okay? So keep your eye on this. Here's one for you. A Rochester-based nonprofit shows the following at 12/31/2018. Okay, negative. It's not positive. They do not have working capital. But when we look, it appears to be good. So 17 days in the working capital, -6 accounts payable, cash conversion cycle, 10.65. Looks good. Now, we see that half of their assets are in receivables. Cash used by operations the past year, 223. Free cash flow was negative, and when we look at it, the debt that is due in 2019, 672 million, versus they don't have enough money to pay it. They have a major liquidity problem and an ongoing concern. Will they be there? They will either need to find additional funding or to restructure the debt. Another example is Tesla, and this changes all of the time, but liquidity risk can mean the cash crunch. It can be temporary or short term, but they generally have an impact on the business. So where we take a look is they have negative working capital, and we can go through and see the same numbers that I calculated, just like I did on Steel Dynamics and what I showed you on the nonprofit. Now let's conclude. The firm has had negative free cash flow as they've been making huge investments in electric vehicle capacity and technology. That's what's happening, negative. Cash flow from operations turned positive. Half of the increase was a result of an increase in accounts payable, so they slowed the process down. The working capital quality is good, with 44% in cash, which is a lot, but they've struggled with meeting targets, and thus variability in the inventory conversion cycles. Vendors are paid way beyond normal terms in manufacturing. So the vendors who are selling to Tesla are funding the company. The existing negative working capital they have is clearly not enough to support additional growth. They're going to, and cash flow, free cash flow and cash provided by operations will not be sufficient enough to make the current portion of long-term debt. And again, they're going to have to restructure debt or issue additional equity. So what they've done has been issuing equity. But I would say with Tesla, there is substantial liquidity risk. So that's the base presentation. Now I'm going to go on to the next piece, and it's the stress test. So take a break, and I'll be back with the stress test in a minute.